Well, welcome everybody to our weekly session on naming in an AI world. And we have a special treat today. We have Laura Schroeder with us, who's been doing naming for quite some time. Let Laura tell a little bit about herself and her background. Then we're going to get into some insights and some questions on what makes for a great namer, some of the things about what Laura's learned with respect to process and certain styles of names that work really well in certain situations and maybe not quite as well in others. So, Laura, if you could just start and tell us a little bit about how you got into this business and where your career has taken you, and then we'll get into some of the learnings perhaps.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much, Mike. Um, well, I started off my career actually in the whole internet boom. And I was there when all the VCs were happening, and I was a project manager, then a product manager, all this, I was fully invested, but I never really had much of a passion for it, I have to be honest. And I met somebody at a party who was talking about what they did. And like you and I know, when people ask naming, what's naming? People don't even realize it's a job.
Right.
And, he worked for a company named Interbrand, and it really intrigued me. I was like, oh, well, I went to the School of Languages and Linguistics at Georgetown. I'm like, I think I have the right background. I love words, big crossword puzzle person. And so then I had that always in the back of my mind. And then maybe like a couple years later, one of my good friends from college, I heard, was director of verbal identity at guess where? Interbrand. I was like, please give me a job. No. No, I called him up. I found out about, what he did, what was involved. And I said, I'd love to get into this. Can you just at least let me help with some name generation? I'll work for free just to get, my feet wet. And that's really how it all kind of started. And I took over someone's role who was on maternity leave. I was moving back from San Francisco to New York. And funny enough, I got pregnant at the time. So, but that's essentially how it all started. And then I fell in love. And so I always remember how long I've been in this because I was pregnant with my first daughter, who's now 18.
Looking back, is there one or two or maybe even three things that were the greatest surprises to you compared to your expectations when it came to developing a name? Like, I thought it would be done this way. I learned something very different. Are there any insights that you could share with us today about, hey, this is what I think really makes for the right way versus what I maybe thought originally wasn't quite correct?
Well, it's interesting because I just think even the way you create names is very different from when I started. And a lot of that has to do with kind of names that were trending. There was a lot of tech companies coming up and they wanted to sound techie. And of course, now we're like anything that ends in K or X or, we kind of want to get away from that. People are going into more the organic nature, abstract names. But a lot of that has to do, of course, that we have over 1 million more trademarks registered than when I started in 2005.
You bet.
I mean, right? So at the time, I, had studied Spanish and Latin. And of course, Latin is the root of so many of our words. So I lived in the Latin English dictionary. I haven't looked at that in 15 years. So it's interesting because then at the time it was all pulling word roots and creating interesting names based on those word roots that you could speak to. And nowadays it's veering a little bit more into that abstract world. And funny enough, I'm seeing a lot more real words out there, which is kind of ironic considering the trademark challenges. But if you find the right abstract word that's a metaphor that people identify with, Apple is of course the famous example, you actually can get the trademark because it's not something anyone else has thought of. It's one of those more disruptive brand names.
I don't know if you can see this beat up copy of the Dictionary of English Word Roots. This is a Latin Greek root word dictionary.
See?
It was first published in 1966. This edition is 1982. So we got started in the business in 85 instead of 2005. I don't think you can buy this anymore. I mean, this thing is so dog-eared. It's one of those books you never want to give up. But I think you bring up something really interesting, Laura, that today, the style of the name that breaks through the clutter and that really resonates isn't necessarily that same style that you were developing back in 2005, 2007 when you were with Interbrand. Why is that? I mean, what do you think has changed the world so that today a very different kind of name is really what needs to be created and suggested to a client?
I think some of it is just trends, right? And then to sound techie, you had a certain ending. And that's a lot of the projects we were getting. But then, we had something like, Microsoft coming to us for their new search engine, and Bing is the name that you came up with. And I think some people want to follow those trends, like the misspelled words, the dropping the vowels, all those things. And some just want to be more of those challenger brands, like, liquid death for water. I mean, you need, and I think it's become so much easier for people to start businesses and companies and products with the internet being a global marketplace, that you really have to find something that breaks through the clutter. So just, pulling these interesting word roots and, more obvious intuitive metaphors isn't going to work anymore. There was a shift from all these early tech brands, years ago with these kind of, as I said, very sort of stereotypical tech sounding names, to now you're seeing names like Lime and Riverbend and, all these organic nature names. So even those names have shifted. But the problem is now those all sound the same.
I think you're bringing up something that I find fascinating and extremely important compared to what AI is disrupting in this space, right? So we've had clients and we've seen a lot of these name generators come and go over the years, and we've tried a lot of them. We've wrote some of the ones back in the 80s and early 90s. And AI is never going to replace a really good human creative for a variety of reasons. One is, I'm not sure any AI generator, LLM agent would ever come up with a name like Liquid Death for a water. Yet it works, but you have to sort of understand culture. You have to understand what is trending, how it's going to be positioned, what is the brand strategy. I mean, we've had clients come to us and ask us to name their bottled water. And if we had suggested a Liquid Death to them, they would have hung up the phone, right? Why is a name like that? Like, what do you think has to be in play? Or as a namer or as a consultant, how do you guide a client on a journey, or where do you start so that a name like Liquid Death would even be in the consideration set? And then how do you go through the obvious concerns with, well, death is such a strong negative. Why in the world would we want to use that? Do you have any guidance or experience there that you'd want to throw out on the table?
We actually had somebody come to speak to us, Andy Pearson from Liquid Death, a couple months ago, and their strategy was essentially do the opposite of what you expect, right?
Right.
And so, which is, look, it does not work for every brand. That's the thing. You can't take that necessarily as an example in the crowded water seltzer market. Yes, you need something really provocative to break through, but that's not the case for all brands. So, as much as I'd like to say, go with an abstract name, you can really connect with the audience, it lends itself to amazing storytelling. It's not necessarily right for every brand. If you're going to go out there with a more unique name, which I'm all for, it really has to be backed up by that unique value proposition, because those names are inherently intriguing, they're tantalizing, they draw somebody in. But if you draw somebody in and you're saying the same thing, it sort of loses its oomph.
What I'm interested in you sharing with us is a project or two that you've worked on that maybe those things were out of sync, right? Because we've had clients come to us over the years, and I know you have too, that has said, hey, we want a name like this. And maybe it's a name like Liquid Death, or it's a name like, Apple or Google or who knows what. But it doesn't really match their budget. It doesn't match their target. They haven't thought through their value prop, perhaps, and align that with, well, does that really support your value prop? Are you willing to put the brand building behind it? Are you willing to take the kinds of risk that you're going to have to take? I mean, you have a project or two like that where you said, man, when we started, it was tough, right? We had some things that we had to sort of line up, and then maybe take us through how you satisfied those needs, right? Like what tricks, what things did you do to maybe bring everything into alignment by the end of the project?
Most clients actually do want something that's intuitive, immediately, resonates with the audience. They don't want to sound like a name that's out of the category.
Right.
They have all these reasons, and people, they also don't really think, like a health insurance is a really good example. Like you have Aetna, that's the name of a volcano.
Right.
There's association there, right? You have Centene, and that name came from the founder who, when he came across from Europe, he had 1 centime, 1 cent in his pocket from France. So, I mean, those are unconventional, but you hear them so often that you don't even think twice. So we had a big health insurance client, and, same story, something, intuitive, blah, 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 blah. And so we're like, okay, we'll try. And I mean, our fallout was like 98%, 95, 98%. And it was very difficult. And the thing is, you have to reveal those stats to your client. Like, these are the challenges that we're up against here. Like, we're not saying go with the name, that is so, we're not saying arbitrary. People confuse sometimes like arbitrary with abstract, and arbitrary really doesn't mean anything. It sounds cool, right? There's no story behind it. But if we can find a name that can break through these trademark challenges, that's, where that nugget might be. So, we went through a couple rounds, putting names like, story or poet narrative, something about like telling the individual story that doesn't feel like uncomfortable, right? Like, oh, I can kind of get behind that. What helps in presenting names is including what we call name stories. So it's a narrative that, use the name in context, like, say like with, author health insurance, you can find a way to get your individual needs, satisfied, that sort of thing. Bring the name to life. They have to hear it in context, because just like all the other names out there that they don't think twice about, like Aetna being a volcano name, they're so used to hearing it in context, it transcends any meeting. So really work to bring that name to life when you're presenting. Show it in the competitive landscape, show it in context. And that really helps. At the end, we often would find that our clients would say, oh, yeah, that kind of like, I get it. I see how that could work.
Yeah, I think one of the things we try to do when we're, for instance, naming a new company or renaming a company is we'll put the name on the side of a really magnificent looking building. So we had a presentation a couple of days ago for a client. And when we put the name like it would be on the building, right, of this magnificent 20-story skyscraper and their name's at the top, and it looks like it's right there on that building, it's like, wow, that looks cool. And you're right, it brings it alive for the CEO or the C-level exec, many of whom don't have that branding background and that ability to sort of picture how it might look once all the magic's wrapped around behind it. Or we drop the name on their business card or on some swag, right? So we show them the name. This is how your business card is going to look. This is how it's going to look on the side of that trade show booth that you have at the medical conference or the pharmaceutical conference or the auto show. It really does make a difference. So story and context, I think you're absolutely right, is a huge a huge way to improve the outcome that we're all seeking and bring the skeptics, which we always have, it seems like, on these projects, to the table. How do you handle the situation? Because we've had this happen, you probably have too, where the most senior person or somebody on the call says, well, I'll know the name when I see it. I am expecting the aha name, right? That name just to jump off the page at me. And that's it, right? That's the name that I want. Have you ever had that happen? And if so, how have you guys dealt with that? Because we certainly have had that happen.
Yeah, that actually happened to us once. So we were the way that we were presenting names is that we would present to the core team first, who then would share with the founder and CEO of the company. So, he obviously has a very vested interest. I mean, talk about emotional connection. And so we presented the first round, he had gone through workshops, we knew the criteria, we knew what they were trying to say. There was no questions. The first round we felt went very well. The founder was not seeing it, He's like, just give me another round.
Right.
Like, okay, great. Got some feedback. And for this round, because of scheduling, his team actually reviewed the names with him one-on-one rather than us. And we had about 10 to 15 names for this follow-up round. And on the second name, he said, that's the one. I want it. And didn't even want to see anything else. And as you know, when you present names, you have time to do preliminary legal search for our audience. That's just a quick knockout search. That's not really diving into everything. It's just like a very high level potential viability of the name candidate.
Right.
So we have, we've done that. We've done our desktop searches, which is Google search to find if anybody's using the name from a common law aspect, because use of a name precedes trademark registration. And also you want to see if there's any mind share. Is there another brand that's so big that it would overshadow this new brand? So that the status of the names that we show is good, but we really don't know the history. So of course the name that he loved, we did a comprehensive search and it didn't work.
Right.
And that's why we always want clients to at least consider 8 to 10 would be ideal to put through that full legal search, because depending on the category, you're lucky to get 1 or 3 that really end up being viable, in my experience. Right. So yeah, and then it's interesting because once that didn't work, we did have other name presentations, and the name that they ended up choosing was actually on that second presentation of ones that he never saw.
Yeah, we always try to start a project by letting every client know that the challenge today is much more clearing a name legally or clearing a name culturally or linguistically than it is coming up with a name that's just very creative and very cool. That's hard to do. But if you come up with a name that's very creative and very cool and cuts through the clutter and all the other things, don't fall in love with that name, right? Until it's crossed all those legal hurdles and those cultural acceptance hurdles. And that's why AI is never going to replace, the full process. We've tested how good a job AI does at trademark screening, and not very good, right? It doesn't find all the phonetic similarities.
They don't know.
What a lot of clients don't understand is how you spell a name really doesn't impact whether you can use the name legally or not. It's Absolutely. How it sounds. So
exactly.
If it's phonetically equivalent, especially when you get into foreign languages where you maybe don't even understand how they're pronouncing that English word, but if it sounds similar to an existing trademark in the space you're in, you've got potential legal problems there, right? And so that is a minefield that I don't think a lot of folks that haven't gone through this for years really appreciate or understand. What do you think is your superpower when it comes to naming? I mean, you've been doing this since 2005. You've got a tremendous number of clients and projects and successful names under your belt. Why are you so good at what you do?
A good namer usually has good vocabulary. They love words, when hopefully it's relevant here, but when I speak, I think there's nothing better than capturing that perfect word to say what you mean. I mean, we have so many words in the language. When you find like that perfect word, use it. Don't use the dumbed down version. So you have to have a love of words. Also, background in other languages really helps. I grew up part of my youth in Puerto Rico, so I was surrounded by Spanish speakers all the time. I took Latin for like 3 or 4 years, and it's interesting how much of the vocabulary I just remember,
Right.
and I look at names and I remember, oh, that's from this and that's from this. So those kind of things just help, to have in your wheelhouse. But then the other thing is, how do you go to explore like those metaphors? Because that's more about like synonyms and, looking up things in the thesaurus, like diving deep into just words. But in today's age, it's really about thinking about those metaphors that could bring that story to life. So for metaphors, it's just a lot of it's research, right? And one thing I can say with AI that it has helped a lot with research. So say you want something that's, and this is a very basic example, something that you want to evoke the idea of fast, Google, like look up what's the fastest bird, what's the fastest animal, what's the fastest vehicle, like, those kind of things. And those can inspire you. But just knowing those different areas to look into and, experience really gives you that. That's one way. And just also, when I see so many names that come in from other people, and, sometimes I just question, have they said I work at XYZ company? Does that actually sound like a company? Is it easy to pronounce? Is it a mouth? You have to say it out loud. Does it really sound authentic? Does it sound valid? Is it what we're trying to evoke for this
Yeah.
brand?
Yeah, I think all those are great examples. Many years ago, we used a tool called Idea Fisher. And it wasn't really a thesauri or a thesaurus. What it was is it took words that conceptually fit a particular picture. So, for example, I think we were naming a vodka or an alcoholic beverage that was infused with milk or cream. And so they wanted something that related to the color. Well, you could put that into thesaurus, and
Right.
you'd put in white, and you'd maybe get something like ivory as a color. But with Idea Fisher or with AI, you would get other things like aspen. Well, aspen would not necessarily pop up as an alternative color for white, but conceptually it might fit the space. Now, it doesn't make sense to use aspen necessarily for the name of a product you drink, but it takes you in, like, it's related conceptually, but it's not necessarily the kind of thing that you would typically find by connecting the most obvious dots. And then another thing, Laura, that you said that I think is, if you've done this enough, you get it. But for a lot of our clients, it's a real value add, is drop it into all the contexts you're going to use it in, right? Think about how it sounds on the phone or at that softball game on a Saturday afternoon when you're talking to friends. Is it easy to say? Does it make sense? Are you going to stumble over the words? Are they going to be able to remember it? Can they spell the thing, right? You talked about misspellings earlier, which was a real fad with some of our clients naming, cell phones, like the Razor phone from Motorola, which was
Right.
intentionally spelled R-A-Z-R.
Right.
Like,
And
if you had
then
never heard that, you wouldn't have a clue that that was spelled that way. And, oh, that's so cool. Well, then everybody wanted to intentionally misspell names because the Razor spelling was so cool. Well,
absolutely.
maybe. I mean, but maybe not. Are there any other tricks, or are there any other things that you think you've learned as a namer, having done this so long, that are sort of, you just do it intuitively because of your language background, because you've been doing this for so long? But folks that have never done this before, it's like, don't forget this. So we've talked about legal, we've talked about, spellings, but are there other things in your bag of tricks that you'd want to mention? Hey, this is another consideration that you guys should be thinking about.
One thing we find a lot of times, and I'm sure you have too, when you're presenting names, there's often somebody in the crowd that says, "Oh, I used to work for a paper company that had that name. I used to work for this company that had that name." Names that are completely in a different category, different trademark, and they might not be that big. I always love to use the example, well, you have Dove soap and Dove chocolate. Does that mean the chocolate tastes like soap or whatever? So people sometimes forget that trademark classes are very important. Now, if you're trying to do Apple, you know, in another category, there's some brands that are too big that you don't want to cause confusion. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's like, could somebody potentially be confusing this name with another brand? So if it's in the same trademark class, that's where you have to worry about it. And remember, often brands, as you know, could be in 3, 4, 5, 20 trademark classes, which makes it even more challenging. The other thing I would say, when people talk about, oh, I want an intuitive name, I really want to know what they do, blah, 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 blah. Your value proposition may change over time. You don't want a name to, limit you in what you might do in the future. You really have to think about, where is my company going to be in 20 years? I mean, think about taglines. Taglines change all the time because a company wants to promote something new. They have a different brand purpose, Names have to have that same names. You can't just keep on swapping out every 5 years when your business change. So you really have to think about that scalability of that name. So have a name that captures more those enduring ideas.
There's a school of thought, and there's even some research that I think supports the narrower the focus the name, the stronger, right? The more potential it has. Because if you use the shotgun approach, right, that you want to try to make the name stand for too many things or relate to too many concepts, it ends up not doing any of those very well. But what I think you're speaking to is different, right? What you're speaking to is there are certain attributes, values, benefits that are enduring. And it gives you the runway to use that same name for decades, which seems ridiculous in today's world, especially in the tech world where things seem to pop up and disappear in a matter of months or a year or two.
Right.
But those values, those attributes are universal and they're appealing. And if you can own one of those in your space and then use the tagline, when I worked for Dr. Pepper when I was in school, we would change, Young and Rubicam was the agency at the time, Y&R. We would change the tag every year or two, right?
Yeah.
It was always Dr. Pepper, but the tagline kept Dr. Pepper relevant year after year to the audience that we were going after. I read in the Wall Street Journal or Ad Age or something this week that Dr. Pepper has now caught up to Pepsi, and I think even surpassed Pepsi as the number 2 brand, the number 2 soft drink brand in the country, which is phenomenal.
Wow.
Well, that was not going to be possible if Dr. Pepper kept changing their brand name, right?
No.
It was only because Dr. Pepper kept the brand the same, but refreshed it, right, with a new tagline and some new sparkle, some new copy, some new ads and whatnot wrapped around it to make it just as relevant today, more relevant today than it was back in the late 70s, early 80s when I was working for the Dr. Pepper company. So I think there are attributes like trust, right? Integrity, premiumness, you get what you pay for, that if you can lock and load on one of those attributes for your company name or your brand name and then refresh it over time. But where have you run into a situation, if you have, where clients come to you and they said, look, we just need a new name. This name is either tarnished because of some bad press or perhaps is too limiting. We want to retain some of the equity we have, but we also want to sort of come up with something new and different. Have you ever run into that? And if you have run into that, how do you try to guide them? Because I think it's difficult to sort of, let's keep the best of what's old, but then let's lock and load on something that's new, and then let's transition the old to the new over some period of time. Maybe it's a discussion around what's the right transition strategy, right? Like how long does it take? How do you do it? What do you do? What don't you do? Do you have any suggestions in that space?
I have worked with some large companies that have rebranded themselves. A lot of times the rebranding could be that maybe one of their other brands has the same name and they want to set
Right.
themselves apart from that, name. So they're, reduces the confusion, like we're the holding company. This is just, it's not the same thing. And then we have other companies who've acquired, some other companies. So their value proposition has truly changed. That happened with one of our clients who had a very, let's just say the name was a mouthful, right? And the name, I don't want to reveal it, but the name had, part of it was very specific to what they did.
Right.
So the name wasn't really working anyway, in our opinion. So the fact that they wanted to rebrand because they had acquired this company that would expand their range of offerings, we thought, well, that was just a blessing. We go through a very similar process. What is the value proposition? What are you trying to convey? How is it different before? A lot of times we have those, diagrams, the old and the new, and, sometimes it's a new take on the old, right? And, you go through a similar process about what are those enduring ideas you want to communicate in the name? What type of name? Are you open to consider an abstract name as part of your exploratory? Great. And oftentimes this has actually happened a few times where the company that they acquired had such a good name that they ended up going with that.
We've suggested to clients that have gone through a lot of M&A, a lot of merger and acquisition activity, and they've sort of by happenstance, inadvertently acquired this portfolio of brands. Don't let that go, right? There are some diamonds in the rough, names that were available 20 years ago. There's no way these short, real word English names, there's no way you could come up with a name like that. So if you still have rights in the name and you're still using the name in some way, renew that trademark, right? Keep that name active, and then maybe you can repurpose it. Maybe you can't, but don't let that portfolio of diamonds and gold that you maybe don't value very, very highly disappear because there may be a new need, a new division, a new company, a new opportunity where you can bring that life to the name to the forefront again, bring it to life, and really, really have a competitive advantage because the name right out of the chute is so strong and so memorable and something that you've owned and had some equity in for quite some time.
Yeah, I have one example I actually can talk about. We were working with JDA, which was a supply chain company, and they had acquired, and since then they've actually been acquired by somebody else. So even the names I'm talking about, I'm not sure if they're in use anymore. Anyway, JDA had acquired a company named Blue Yonder. I mean, talk about a scalable name,
right?
Optimistic, aspirational. And we went through the whole naming journey with them, but at the end of the day, even we agreed that's a powerful name, and that's what they ended up using. But it's good to go through that journey just to make sure, you have this bar and you have one that actually can do more than Blue Yonder, especially with a name that's already established. You have part of that investment already out there. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, especially, like you said, with the trademark challenges as they are. I mean, it's not a bad approach.
Another thing that we had talked about before we got online here was the mindset of the client and how to facilitate that mindset by taking the negative off the table so that they start from an advocate mindset viewpoint versus the critic, right? It's very easy to start with, well, let me tell you what I don't like about this name. Let me tell you what I don't like about that name. And you get the ball rolling down the wrong side of the hill, right? Because every name's got problems. And some of the best names have the most glaring weaknesses. So by saying, look, we don't want you to think about what's wrong with all of these names initially. Rather, wear that advocate hat and think about of the names that we've presented, those that have the most potential, even with some qualifiers and some concerns. We'll talk about why that name might work, right? And so you get them thinking about, hey, this name does have possibilities and it might work. And I think one of the things that we have both done in our respective consultancies is before anyone starts talking, they do a little poll. We have them all vote on their top 5. Tell me what you guys have done before, because I think it was similar, but not quite the same thing before you opened up the conversation.
Right. So we present all the names, and at the end we have a survey, and we would have all the names listed. We would also include the rationale or name story, just so, because people don't always remember. And then we would have them vote, yes, maybe, no, essentially. And so maybe was always like on the fence, not sure, let's discuss kind of idea. And then what we would do is, you can very quickly, in less than 5 minutes, you have the results, and then you show them like what are the top 8 names. Right. Never reveal the score.
Right.
Sometimes they can be very high, and sometimes it could just be a little over half. But the point is, it's a great way to facilitate the discussion so everyone's voice can be heard. It's anonymous voting, and it really helps. And then, you also talk about names that aren't in the top 8, because somebody might just have a strong point of view and really love one name that nobody else did. And I've seen them convince everybody else that let's bring this one into the shortlist as well.
Yeah, but I think encouraging that kind of open conversation by giving everyone anonymity in the call. Like if you have someone's boss's boss on that call, right? The final decision maker, whether that's the CEO or the founder or a VP in a very large company. And you've got the workhorses, right? The guys and the gals that are down in the trenches, the branding and Marcom folks that are going to have to make this thing work. They may be a little bit intimidated, but by giving everyone that ability to do that poll without revealing who they are, and then all of a sudden the boss's boss sees that his or her favorite name isn't the one that the rest of the team voted on, that really is a much better place to start at than not do the poll. And as soon as the most senior person on the call says, well, I don't like this name, even though that was the name everybody else loved, no one's going to contradict at that point, right? And so now you've got a problem. So I think that's a brilliant strategy. We've used it for a few years. You've obviously used it. And it really does help start the conversation in the right direction. Is there anything else, Laura, that you've done maybe in general across all clients, or maybe for a few specific clients that, boy, if we hadn't done that, it would have been a disaster, or we didn't do it? And man, we're really having now to change course midstream because we forgot to do something that we were almost kicking ourselves about, had we could have gone back and done it all over again. Is there anything like that, like any mistakes or any learnings that either you're really happy you did it this way, or man, I wish we had done it that way?
Yes. We were working with a big healthcare company, and they were naming a foundation on health equity, right? Promoting health equity, and doing the, we did a little audit of the category, and most foundations are either the name of the master brands in the name, or it's the name of the founder. You don't have many like evocatively named, or just other kind of names. It's usually the founder, the master brand, and very descriptive, I might add. And so, we showed them, our findings. They were like, great. And they said, well, we'd like, something, a little bit of each. We're not going to use the founder name. We don't want to use our name, but, explore like the spectrum. But based on who they are and just our experience in working with them before, we thought it would be beneficial to do something what we call a tissue session. And that comes from like the old advertising way of presenting something on tissue paper that's just meant to foster ideas and just get their like initial reaction, and then you can crumple it up and throw it away. So we do this with, I do this with clients that I'm sort of like, I don't know, if we just go right to the name presentation in a few weeks, we could potentially end up having to do another round, because sometimes also people think they know what they want, and then when you actually put it in front of them, like some quirky names, they're like, I don't know, maybe that's not quite right for us. So in any case, with this client, we decided to do a tissue session. So what we do is we come up with names. We either divide them by type of names, like, real words and, invented, for example,
Right.
or by theme, just depending on what it is. So, and they're usually not legally screened at all because we're just trying to get their reaction, right? So it turned out that they really liked these invented words using Latin roots. I mean, it was clear as day they liked these more, invented words, which was not intuitively what we would have thought at all.
Right.
And we had so many names, real words, a little bit more like descriptive, enhanced descriptive. And that learning was invaluable because when we had our name presentation, we had hardly any of those. I would say 75% of our names fell in the other camp.
Right.
So that can be very helpful, and it's pretty easy to do. You kind of do a halfway through the naming process where we already have a bunch of names done. We tell them these are illustrative. We just want to get your reaction. So that can be very helpful.
So, and that sort of brings me into the last topic I wanted to cover with you, which you had mentioned earlier, that abstract names aren't necessarily the same thing as arbitrary names. And then you had also sent me a white paper you had written, or a little paper you'd written on the value of abstract names. So share with us a little bit about when you would advocate for an abstract name, what you mean by an abstract name, how it's different than an arbitrary name. I just think that would be a learning and an insight that a lot of the listeners would appreciate.
Right. So an abstract name, let me start from the beginning. When you think about names, we as namers think about them on a spectrum. And some of us use different terms to describe the names, but in general, you have your more descriptive sounding names that say exactly what they are. Then you have something like enhanced descriptive, which might use a more evocative term paired with a, descriptive term like, I'm trying to think of like beach body fitness, right?
Right.
The beach is a little bit more evocative. If it was just called beach, nobody would know what it is. So it gives it a little bit of a, connection, more of a evocative way of saying it. And then we have something called evocative. And so those are those names like, Elevance, you've heard, the Anthem Holding Co., where you look at it and you think, oh, well, that kind of sounds like relevance. It kind of sounds like advance. It kind of sounds like elevate. The average user, average audience could kind of figure out what it means. So it's a little different, but it spurs some ideas. Then you have abstract names. And abstract names are the type of names that do have a story behind the name, but they use unexpected metaphors or unexpected word parts that might not easily be obvious to the average person. And our famous example is like Apple, that was a big disruptor. Or if you think of a name that's more invented, you think of something like Hulu, which was, inspired by the hula hoop, which is a project I worked on. NBC was actually the original company that started that initiative, the streaming service, and they wanted to compete with Netflix, which had a more boring name. And they wanted something that sounded engaging, interactive, playful. And so that's how Hulu was born. Then you have arbitrary names, and I can't actually think of any, but it's actually like a name that has no relevance for anything. Actually, Xerox might not be a bad example because the brand just becomes associated with what that is. So I wouldn't really advocate for those arbitrary names, but I do think abstract names have a lot of potential. And, like I was saying before, they allow you to be a little bit more scalable, flexible.
I think it's a great example. We've had clients come to us that wanted to have a very premium name. And I say, well, what are you talking about? And they say, well, we want a name like Lexus. And you talk about an arbitrary name. I mean, Lexus doesn't mean anything. I mean, you have to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars that Toyota spent to build the Lexus brand for it to then take on all the premium feel. Not many of our clients have the financial wherewithal or the time or the competitive position in the marketplace to do that. So then you dial it back. And so, for instance, you were talking about Hulu. And I can remember a New York Times reporter calling me about the fad with Plus for all the streaming services, and how you had, this plus and that plus, and is that really a good strategy or not? And then NBC came up with Peacock. And I thought Peacock was brilliant.
Perfect.
And I think, Discovery Plus and, Paramount Plus, I don't think that's brilliant at all. I think that's boring. And it's me too. And Peacock, it leans into, for us old timers, the logo, right?
Of course. Yeah.
The Peacock logo, but it had enough of a story behind it that it distanced itself and allowed NBC to do some things that were pretty cool. So anyway, there's always this creative aspect that as namers we love, but we also have to make sure it's not so esoteric or so highbrow or doesn't have the story behind it, so it doesn't connect. Is there any last thought that you'd like to leave the listeners or the viewers with that, hey, if you just remember one thing that I've learned in naming for almost 20 years, the one thing that I would want to leave you with, that focus on this or remember this when you come up with the new name, what pops to mind?
I would say that, and we hear our clients say this too, I want the name to be memorable. Right. What does memorable mean? What makes something easy to remember? It's that quick backstory. If you have to give me a paragraph about why this name makes sense, you've lost me. I want you to tell me. Hoka. What's the name Hoka? It means to fly. Oh, they're running shoes. I get it. It's very accessible. It's got to be pronounceable. As we said, say it out loud. Does it actually sound good when you present it? It should be easy to spell. It can still be a unique word, an invented word, but it has to be easy to spell. I can't tell you how many times somebody's told me where they work and, wait, what was the spelling of that again? Wait, what? Does that start with a K or it has to be very straightforward. You have to have those accessible names. Real words, they're your friend, but they've got to be a little bit more removed from the category. But the success of using a real word is people already have that emotional connection.
And I think memorability is so important. We've talked about this for a long time too, because if you can't get the name to stick inside the head of your customer, your prospect, nothing else matters. You'll burn through your entire brand building budget trying to get the unaided awareness scores up to where they need to be before you can start building preference, before you can start building your brand. So if you start with a name that's inherently forgettable or inherently me too, you're never going to win. You're never going to cross the finish line ahead of the competitors, regardless of how much money you have to spend. So an example that comes to mind, and this is the problem we've had with a lot of our clients who want that more suggestive, descriptive name, is back in the day when search engines first got started, there was a search engine called InfoSeek.
Yeah, I remember that.
Very descriptive. And I can remember, that everyone, oh, that's a great search engine name. And then Google came along. And nobody had a clue what Google was, but it was a very different word. And people said, it was such an odd name. What are you talking about, right? It was memorable. It cut through the clutter. And people wanted to hear, tell me the story. Well, as soon as they heard the 10, 15-second story, it was a very sticky name. Now, I'm not saying Google was successful because of their name. They were successful because of all kinds of other things. But Google's the kind of name you want.
Yes.
If you're looking for memorability, not the InfoSeek, because there were a zillion other seek that's and info thises out there in the space. It was an inherently forgettable name, even though it was very descriptive of the category at the time.
Right. I would agree. But I would also say that, for clients that are worried about that investment and how can we get behind this name, we don't have that kind of budget. If a name is unique, intriguing, distinct, that can do some of the heavy lifting. And a lot of times, it's really that initial investment that may be higher. Over the long term, maybe not, because it has that stickiness. Right. So I have to say today, all the traditional ways of getting your name out there, they still exist, but there's so many other ways that, don't cost as much. You've got social media, for instance. There's other ways of getting your name out there through word of mouth, building communities online that don't, hit the budget like, the old days when you wanted to promote awareness of your brand.
We often will talk to clients about short-term versus long-term trade-offs. And it used to be that the long-term, like if you went with a more distinctive, unusual, evocative name, it wouldn't necessarily hit the ground running quite as quickly. So you'd have to make a little bit more of that investment short-term in terms of telling the story, spending the money. But long-term, it was a much more protectable, ownable, distinctive name. But with social media and with your ability to use that as a distribution channel where you can get the word out quickly across all the platforms you're on, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, you can, for a whole lot less money, start to tell that story, start to build the brand around something that's more distinctive and ownable. So you don't have to make that big, huge investment in terms of time and money. And now everyone in your space has sort of heard of the name, and it is more distinctive. So you have stronger IP protection, stronger legal rights in the name, and you're off to the races.
Well, I have an interesting stat that I found that Hoka and On, running shoes.
Sure.
They spent over 4 years, they spent less on marketing and grew 50% than Nike spent in 2 weeks.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, so it's not necessarily, and they've just done a wonderful, but that's a good case where both those shoes are very unique design. They've
Correct.
got these unique names.
Right.
They can back it up.
Well, Laura, you've been awesome. If somebody would like to reach out to you because of all your experience and maybe look at you as a naming resource, how would they best get a hold of you?
You look up Laura Schroeder naming. I think you'll find me. Just make sure you spell it SCHROEDER. I can also be found on LinkedIn. If you look up Laura Schroeder brand.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for your time. You've been just a delight to talk to. Have a great rest of your week.
Okay, you too. Thanks, Mike.
You bet.
All right, bye.
See ya.